Welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Moore-Kilgannon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Parkland Institute, and it is my great pleasure to be moderating the session today. We have had an amazing week of keynote speakers. I hope those of you who are able to join us today have had a chance to take in some, if not all, of our speakers. Our talks this week have touched on some really challenging topics, the many contagions that are impacting on our society today that we as citizens must figure out how to address so that we can move forward and build the province and the country that we want. We heard on Monday night from Catherine Harrison about how fundamentally important it is that we must, as a country, address climate change. We heard from Dr. Danielle Martin how we must be investing in ways to improve our public healthcare system and not to be privatizing it as we're seeing so much with our current government. On Wednesday night, Judge Marian Buhler gave a very powerful talk on how important it is that we have difficult conversations, that we must build relations in order to address the systemic racism within our institutions and within our society. On Thursday, Armin Yalnizyan gave a great talk on how we must demand an economic recovery that addresses the fundamental issues of inequality and supports a more caring society. And last night, I hope you were able to join us for Thomas Homer Dixon talking about his new book on building, commanding hope, and how we must build hope that is honest, astute, and powerful to bring about the change that we need. So this afternoon, we are taking this back to Alberta here. We have 6 fantastic Albertans who we've asked to reflect on what solutions we need to build the Alberta we want. Before I introduce the first panel of those speakers, though, I want to again thank all of our conference sponsors. There's no way we could have hosted this conference without their support, and so we really appreciate the support we got from the Alberta Federation of Labour, the Alberta Public Interest Research Group, Athabasca University's Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the Civic Services Union, Local 52, the Non-Academic Staff Association here at the University of Alberta, the United Nurses of Alberta, the University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts, and the Wordsworth Irvine Socialist Fellowship Endowment. We also got a special contribution from the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, who has allowed us to record these events and to make them available on our YouTube site once the fabulous team at the Arts Resource Center has a chance to edit them and put them up there. I also want to thank our media sponsors again, CJSR Radio, the campus radio station here at the U of A, and of course the fabulous magazine, Alberta Views magazine. You may have seen in your emails that Alberta Views has provided a special discount code for any of the Parkland attendees that want to get a year's subscription for only $20. You just put in Parkland into the, when you're making that registration. And given it's Christmas coming up, you might want to consider those for Christmas gifts. So, of course, if you've enjoyed the conference and want to support the work of the Parkland Institute, we're asking all of you who are able to please consider making a one-time contribution, or better yet, to be able to become one of our monthly contributors. That really helps us a lot. We have so much research and public programming that we want to do here at the Institute, and so we need your help and support to allow this to happen. As we've seen with all of our talks, we had an elder open our conference on Monday evening, and every night we do want to recognize the land that we're on. So in recognizing that where we are, I would like to acknowledge that the City of Edmonton is on Treaty 6 territory, of which the city and its citizens have enjoyed the benefits of treaty. We acknowledge and honor all our ancestors, traditions, and spirit of this gathering place that first drew Indigenous peoples, the Cree, Nakota, Dene, Blackfoot, Métis, and then the settlers to this special place. We acknowledge that wherever you are in Alberta, we are all treaty people. So this afternoon, we have 3 very dynamic Albertans who are joining us to discuss what must be done now to construct a more just, democratic, and sustainable Alberta. We're going to divide them up into 2 separate panels so that it is more interactive dialogue between them and with you, our conference participants. Each panelist has been asked to come prepared with a 5-minute talk on their insights to the complex challenges facing the province and the solutions and steps we need to take for building the Alberta we need. No small challenge to talk about those things in 5 minutes, but I'm sure all our panelists are up to the task. So after each of them speak, I'll facilitate a dialogue between each of us for about 15 minutes, and then we will open it up for questions from all of our participants. So, and then move to the next 3 panelists for the last hour. Again, please note that if you want to open up the chat feature, you will be able to see a few web links that we will be posting throughout the panel discussion, as well as for you to be able to share your own thoughts, respectfully, of course, with other participants. And then when it comes time for questions, we'll be using the Q&A feature, not the chat feature, for you to add your questions or to upvote using the little thumbs up button, any questions you think are strong and what you would like to see asked. Without further ado, the first panel, I will introduce each of them now in order that they will be speaking, and then I'll turn it over to them for their first 5 minutes. So our first speaker is going to be Heather Smith, President of the United Nurses of Alberta, which represents more than 30,000 registered nurses, registered psychiatric nurses, and allied workers. Heather came to Alberta in 1976 from Ontario and soon became active in the union, serving on every bargaining committee since 1984 and becoming president in 1988. She received the Spirit of Tommy Douglas Award in 2007 for her commitment to the dreams of the late Saskatchewan Premier and creator of Canadian Medicare. After Heather, we will have Dr. Ubaka Ogbogu. Dr. Ogbogu is an associate professor in the faculties of law and pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences, and the Cates Research Fellow in Health Law and Science Policy at the University of Alberta. Ogbogu is a Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow and a recipient of the Confederation of Alberta Faculties Association Distinguished Academic Early Career Award. Ogbogu is a nationally recognized expert in the field of health law and policy, law and technology, and bioethics. And Melanee Thomas will be the third of our panel speakers. She's an associate professor and graduate program director in the Department of Political Science at the University of Calgary. She researches the causes and consequences of gender-based political inequality, with a particular focus on political attitudes and behavior. Her current projects include an exploration of the effects of gender, socialization, and psychological orientations to politics, an examination of the role electoral districts play in representational diversity, a study of how gendered mediation affects how voters see themselves and candidates as political actors, and an exploration of public and elite opinion about the environment, the economy, and climate change. So as you can see, we're in for a real treat. I will ask Heather to lead us off with your insights, Heather, into the complex challenges facing the province and the solutions and steps we need to take for the Alberta we need. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Bill. Well, this is quite an undertaking. You took the words out of my mouth, Bill, in terms of trying to talk about the challenges and the solutions in healthcare in Alberta in 5 minutes is in fact an impossible challenge. As I thought about this, doing this Zoom meeting, and I'm actually here in our offices across from what was once my work site, the Edmonton General Hospital, now called the Edmonton General Continuing Care Center, and also has unfortunately the dubious distinction today of being the second deadliest COVID site here in Alberta, 32 deaths so far at the old Edmonton General. But I think the biggest challenge for healthcare in Alberta is exactly the same as it was 30 years or more ago when that site across from me was a fully functioning acute care hospital. It is a challenge, and the threats brought to the healthcare continuum, and I do mean the continuum from home to acute care, by political ideology. To sum it all up, I was part of a fight back at the old Edmonton General across the street when we were forced, that site was forced in going to Grey Nuns to contract out laundry. Even though it was believed it would be poorer quality and more cost, it was a political ideology. And unfortunately, I think that is what still surrounds and warps healthcare costs and delivery here in the province of Alberta. I'm not going to go into the details about what's actually happening today for healthcare workers, nurses, and other healthcare workers in terms of the pandemic, but I can only say that Alberta is incredibly lucky to have the dedicated personnel they do, who are working at great cost to themselves and their families in terms of trying to keep the system together. I guess in terms of talking ideology, I'm surrounded here by papers. You won't see it here, but what the ideology we've had ebb and flow over the years, and just in terms of long-term care and what's happening in long-term care here in our province and across the country, it didn't just happen. It was here in Alberta, it absolutely didn't just happen. It was decades of political decision-making that not just opened the doors to private delivery, but actually encouraged, invited them in, and actually paid them to come and set up shop in terms of partnerships with private, using public monies to build private facilities. And that was part of a very intentional set of political decisions and ideology going back decades in terms of offloading the costs to individuals and their families in terms of that piece of our Medicare system. And we are now seeing it progress at a very disconcerting rate in terms of what Alberta, the UCP government, wants to achieve. We've been on the roller coaster, as I've said. The third wave for many of you here will still be a reality. Unfortunately, what we now have is a government that is clearly articulating in its policies, while clearly articulating within its party's policy, but perhaps being a little duplicitous in terms of what it says to the public. Because if you look at the UCP policies, party policies, pre-election, they believes the government of Alberta should support publicly funded, privately delivered health services. And then most recently, of course, that the government of Alberta should support the option of a privately funded and privately managed healthcare system. The presentation by Dr. Danielle Martin, although it's not up yet in terms of the Parkland YouTube, will be. It covers pretty much everything that needs to be said in terms of potential solutions, not just in Alberta, but right across Canada in terms of costs and issues and access and that kind of stuff, waiting lists. I will say that what I think is the biggest need in terms of solutions is we need people. We need advocacy and we need action. And there is a multitude of resources to help people be prepared to participate in action. I've got the Public Interest Alberta priorities for Alberta seniors. It's a fabulous tool. I'm not going to go through the kinds of recommendations, but they deal with all of the issues that we have here in health, in long-term care. I've got here with me the privatization pressures in public health care, a Parkland Institute publication. There's all kinds of stuff. The biggest threat in terms of our ability to get to solutions is actually something the government is doing to unions, which is Bill 32, which is an attempt to silence and defund advocacy activities by unions, and as with the support of the unions, the public. That is, I think, one of the other, if not the other biggest challenge we have in advocating and seeing change in healthcare is we have a government that also wants to silence us. I'm going to end, I know I'm over time, with just a quote I always use because it's so important in terms of what we have to do to actually get to the solutions that have been identified by so many others already and so many in our province, is that we have to support the ability of unions to be able to speak up. And Bill 32 is what wants to take away.
It's great, Heather. Yes, and we will get to the conversation and the discussions. You raised a lot of great points. Ubaka?
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Heather. That was great. Much of what I'm going to say, you've already said. So I'm also going to focus on the healthcare system because that's the area that I work in. And I'm going to talk about healthcare policy. As well, if I have some time, I'll sort of reflect very quickly on the pandemic response, what I think a better solution to pandemic response that is not reflected in what the government is doing right now. So I think the big issue with our healthcare system is that it's costly and that it doesn't produce the kind of efficiency you want it to produce for the kind of money we invest in it. And I don't think that the government is actually wrong on this, the current government. It's a problem that has existed, one that we ought to acknowledge. It has nothing to do with, political affiliations. It's just a problem. It's a provincial problem. It's a national problem. And so I think a good starting point is to acknowledge that the government is not wrong in terms of describing what the problem is. However, in Alberta, there have been two approaches, and to some extent nationally, there have been two approaches, and I'm putting them in two big buckets for solving this problem. The first is this idea that private delivery and private financing is the way to solve it, largely. I'm paraphrasing a lot here. So private delivery, private financing with deep cuts, in the case of our current government, deep cuts across all areas as a way to solve it. The other approach is the do nothing, but don't make it worse approach. And I think that's very reflective of maybe how the NDP government approached this. I think both approaches are actually quite wrong, and they don't reflect the evidence with respect to what we know can bring about a change to the system. And I think we've been switching, as Heather suggested, this has been a problem that's been there forever, and we've been switching between these two approaches. Well, we've stayed largely with one approach, the first approach, but the switching between the two approaches does not produce any results. So what can the solutions be? As anyone here who studies complexity knows, complex problems demand complex solutions. The problem is that, whenever people try to solve this, they start to go to, the specifics that they get into that I don't think match the size of the problem. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to say, okay, these are 5 things that will solve the problem. Part of the difficulty that someone like me has with suggesting solutions is that I don't have an inside view of the system. I don't actually know what the government knows, but I know that the two approaches that the governments have taken will not solve the problem. Why? Because we've ignored some elements of the problem that lend themselves to a good solution. So one of the things we've ignored, for example, is long-term care. That is a chronic problem for our system. And unless we actually figure out long-term care, I don't think we can come up with a good solution. The second thing is health promotion. We are terrible as a country with health promotion. We just don't do health promotion. We don't resource it, we don't finance it. And until we figure it out, until we actually stop focusing on medicine as the story of the healthcare system, we're not going to get anywhere. The third is social determinants of health. Thinking broader, we don't do that very well. We won't have a solution unless we do that better. The fourth is indigenous health. We're terrible at that as well. Now, some provinces like British Columbia have started to tackle it in collaboration with the federal government and with the First Nations of BC. They have a system there that I think is much more reflective of the direction I want to see us go in Alberta. But we're not even close to it. And until we start to take it seriously, until we stop doing the jurisdictional, back and forth and passing the buck, we can't get to the heart of that problem and to solving it. And if we don't solve it, we're not going to have a solution to a good solution to our healthcare system. Those are some of the problems that we haven't grappled with. What are the solutions that we can start to think about? Very quickly, I'm thinking of big ticket items because, again, I don't have an inside view of the system. I can't propose solutions that go to specifics, but I can think of big bucket things that can be solutions. The first, and I think Heather already sort of hinted at this, is politics. The biggest challenge to solving the problem is politics. We need the right politics. We've never had it. Now, we basically have two options in this province, two realistic options. I think one of them is closer to the right politics, but none of them are the right politics. I'm happy to elaborate in the question period. The second is that we need to trend national and stop thinking in insular ways. Again, I think there's a better political party that reflects sort of a move towards the national and not this insularity that we see presently. Healthcare is not going to be solved by thinking of it as a provincial concern. We have to trend national because some of the big solutions are national. The first solution that's big is a national seniors strategy, a way of solving long-term care across the country. It has to be that we come up with a transdisciplinary model of care that focuses on seniors. Because if we do that, we can free up hospitals to take care of acutely ill people, perform healthcare procedures, but we need a strategy that takes care of seniors and treats them as actually, members of our society who deserve to be treated with respect, given that, they're the persons who actually built the system. We need to think about a full spectrum of medically necessary care. I could explain this to you, but it's best to just quote from my colleagues, Colin Flood, who is a national authority on this subject, and Brian Thomas. Here's what they say. Under our current system, surgical removal of bunion, I might not be saying that well, falls under universal coverage, while self-administered but life-saving insulin shots for diabetics do not. A modernized Canada Health Act will hold the provinces accountable for reasonable rationing decisions across the full spectrum of medically necessary care. Again, not just surgical wait times or surgeries, the full spectrum, pharmacare, health promotion, all of it. Lastly, we need to reduce unnecessary testing, because part of the story of surgical wait times is how we actually go about testing. We need to reduce that. We need to invest significantly, as I said before, in health promotion. And again, to emphasize this, I can't emphasize this enough, until we start to care about social determinants of health and about Indigenous health, we won't get very far with solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ubaka. That was really fantastic. I know it's a challenge to do in 5 minutes, and we'll have a chance to connect with our audience and have further conversations to dig into some of those key points. So, Melanie?
Great, thank you so much for this. I am not connected in healthcare or connected to Alberta through healthcare, except through personal experience. And so it's a real delight to be on this particular panel, because my first political memory is my mother as a registered nurse walking on the Wildcat picket line that the nurses walked on in the late 1980s. I distinctly remember as a child of a registered nurse what the Klein cuts were like throughout the 1990s. And I also am a political scientist precisely because my mother sat me down in the late 90s when I was nearing my completion for my high school graduation. So now you know how old I am. But she actually sat me down and she made me promise to her that I wouldn't go into any health-related field because of the politics. It's perhaps not a surprise that I became a political scientist instead, and it's also not surprising that I think that I went and first looked at questions of gender and politics as well. For me, the largest problem that I see that links to what my colleagues have been speaking is a question of democratic malaise. And I want to highlight two concepts. None of this is new, and my concerns with respect to what this means for Alberta and Alberta politics are also not new, but I do see changes and escalations in the manifestation of both of these concepts that I think are challenges that we need to address urgently. So the first problem relates to a concept called losers' consent. And democracies are unique in that the process through which we assign accountability and the process through which we deliver power are created through elections, and elections automatically create winners and losers. Those who win or perceive that they have won are satisfied by the process, and people who feel like they've lost in the process are almost always dissatisfied as a result of that. What's particularly important for democracies, though, is that losers give consent to two things. They consent to be governed by a government that they're not satisfied with right out of the gate, but they also consent to play again. They consent to repeat the process. What's particularly important about losers' consent, and I think particularly relevant to Alberta, though, is that when people feel as though losing is novel to them, this idea that there's an entitlement to power, and when that power is taken away, it produces a much stronger negative reaction. It produces this much stronger idea that the loss is dissatisfying and that the loss is somehow unjust. This is exacerbated by things like partisanship and ideology as well. The other thing that I think forcefully cues Alberta politics to me is this idea that people who feel like the electoral process repeatedly makes them losers, if they think they can just never win, they simply exit. They exit the democratic process. I mean, they just exit. It's one of the things that becomes really clear. The second concept from political behavior research I want to highlight is this idea of polarized, effective partisanship. And so when I'm talking about polarized partisanship in this context, I don't mean people who are taking extreme views. I mean people's emotional connection to political parties. This is the idea that partisanship and ideological identification is about group belonging. It's divorced from substance and policy. It's very much us versus them. Winning and losing is seen as existential. It's seen as closely tied to individual self-concepts and to self-esteem. What this means is that when people perceive that the party that they identify with as a group, where their individual identity rests, if they win, they become euphoric. They see that as connected to their sense of self, and it makes them feel really great about themselves. But when they lose, or if they hear people critiquing their party, and they're in this kind of like polarized affective frame of mind, they see criticisms of the party as criticisms of themselves as people, and like kind of like fundamental parts about their character. Here is where anger becomes really important. The most angry are the people who are the most highly polarized, even if they hold relatively moderate views. This is, again, the extremeness or not of the positions that people take doesn't drive a lot of this. What drives it is the extent to which they feel as though they're divided into this us versus them kind of campment. And the kicker for this too is that people are prepared to celebrate policies that hurt them if it means that they can beat the other side. What this means for Alberta is that on the right, I think the 2015 election cut them to the quick in terms of losers' consent. And so this kind of like negative feeling about the illegitimacy of the process, because we don't regularly change governments, was exacerbated in 2015, and it leads directly to the formation of the United Conservative Party, but of also a lot of like gendered violent attacks directed at then Premier Notley. On the left, I see a lot of exit and a lot of hopelessness, like literal exit, but also a lot of literal hopelessness. And then also people saying, we need to form a new party because otherwise we can't deal with any of this. With respect to polarized effective partisanship, my number one concern is that I actually see this as being used as an effective political tool of division from the government. I think that this is the number one tool in Jason Kenney's toolkit that he reaches to be able to make this feeling that some of the policies are okay, even though they hurt us, because it's about us beating them. If the them is Trudeau and the federal government, or if it's another political party or something along those lines, the whole point is that people are prepared to accept things that hurt them because it means that they win. For solutions, these apply to a diverse context, not just Alberta. We need to make following democratic norms normal again, and we need to actually have sanctions for those who violate those norms of good behavior in democracy. We need to organize on two fronts. One is with respect to the democratic process and elections, but the others is with an explicit definition of what it means to be an Albertan, and that has to include Albertans in all of their diversity, rather than the narrow version of us that is coming from certain political elites. I think we need to have a gut check when people talk about opposition. Are you opposing because it's coming from a particular group, or are you opposing on substantive grounds? And then the final thing, and I can't stress this enough, that as voters, we need to take our democratic power back. It's supposed to rest with us. And accountability ultimately is supposed to rest with us. And what I worry is that we've got all of this exit where people are just prepared to abdicate their power. Really looking forward to the discussion that follows.
Thank you for that, Melanie. No worries. It's all very important stuff for us to think about as citizens, what our role is going to be and how we are going to make the change that's necessary. But I'm going to just have a conversation between the four of us, if we could, getting at some of the things that were raised by our keynote speakers earlier in the week. And both Heather and Ubaka raised the notion that Dr. Martin raised as well, with respect to getting at some fundamental root causes in a very systemic way, whether that be a national long-term care strategy or looking at social determinants of health. So I'll start with you, Heather. Can you sort of elaborate further about what key things that we need to be doing and advocating for, and what we want our governments and our systems to be doing that really address some of the fundamental root causes within our healthcare system?
Dr. Martin's comments and with respect to the determinants of health are really important for people to see. So I hope people do go back and see that webinar when it's posted. But if you even think about pharmacare, which will be a cost saving across the continuum for employers, for employees, for governments, that in itself would be an important part of rebalancing some of the inequities in terms of determinants of health. And the major determinants of health are who you are and where you live, are you employed? And if you think, there were very concerning statistics in her remarks in terms of the Canadians who have lost pharmaceutical coverage, their prescription drug coverage, simply because of losing their job in the pandemic, which has incredible downstream impacts for us, because if individuals are not taking appropriately prescribed and necessary medications in terms of maintaining health stability, then we end up paying for admissions to hospitals, et cetera. So, I mean, that's just a small example. And so if we look to creating more equality in terms of things that determine health, we can actually get to the things that we need to do to improve the delivery and the distribution of health services and health personnel. So she had some really great suggestions in there, but I think that's really what she was getting at, is that, we're woven together. Health is a part of what we need to do as a society in terms of rebalancing, redistribution of things that affect health, and ultimately will alter the cost of health. And I noticed Ubaka's comments in terms of a cost of health, and it keeps being said here, that the health is an ever increasing portion of the provincial budget. Well, of course it is, if you continue to reduce the stuff you spend on other stuff. So.
No, that's great. Thank you, Heather. Ubaka, you talked about complex problems requiring complex solutions, and certainly social determinants of health, or how we support our seniors going forward, is a really critical issue. Can you elaborate further on what you see those solutions being?
Of course. As I said in my comments, I think we do that very poorly. What I mean by that is that we focus a lot on this idea of medically necessary care, which is really focused on the diagnostic and curative aspects of healthcare. We don't see health for what it is, as a way of being that a system can support and promote, so that we don't get to a point where we're spending a ton of money trying to correct. This is actually ordered along the lines of wealth, opportunity, race, gender. So there's serious issues of justice and inequity that allows, people who actually benefit from this sort of medically necessary care system to fight for that and that alone, and not fight for, the things that will promote, because it doesn't seem like health to them. It doesn't promote the interests of people who are outside that system. So if you think about the kind of investment in something like cancer care, for example, I don't want to say that that's not important, but investment on cancer care compared to investment on health promotion or investment on social determinants of health that may raise, our indigenous populations, our racialized populations, there's a world of difference there. There's also the fact that healthcare is tied to the Medicare we have, but also tied largely in terms of extra services to employment. I think we need to decouple, how we provide and pay for healthcare from employment. That's a big issue for me. Until we do so, a huge swath of our population will not have access to healthcare. I have, the full suite of healthcare one could have, even things I don't need, and it's being paid for every month by the University of Alberta. But I don't need that stuff. But there are people who don't have employment, who need that stuff, who don't have access to it. This is a complex problem, and if you're going to solve it, you really need to sort of go to the root causes, unearth them, and turn them on their head. And I don't think we're starting to do that. I think, anytime we talk about healthcare, the focus is always on this system we've created that allows us to sort of focus on curative and diagnostic aspects of care without thinking about, all the other surrounding things that create a kind of complexity that doesn't make it any cheaper or efficient as a system.
Thank you. And I think, Melanie, the start of your talk was interesting, where you linked your move into political science from a perspective of how it related to women and healthcare and your mother's role and stuff like that. Can you talk about the connection, I should say, about how healthcare is a key motivator and how people connect to the view of healthcare as it relates to who we are as citizens? Healthcare and the public healthcare systems become very connected to our notion of country and why we support it so much. How does that then relate to people getting engaged politically in that process, advocating and fighting for that public healthcare system?
It does feature into this idea of identity, right? The idea that Canadians identify as a place where there's a mythology about just what our healthcare is and how it's not American, and all of the vagaries of what it means to identify as a Canadian vis-a-vis the United States gets loaded up into the stereotypes or the shiny view that people have of healthcare. And I've noticed something like this coming up in the chat as well. One of the things I've noticed in Alberta and how healthcare is used as a political mobilization is that it gets deployed in very rhetorically strategic ways, right? And so you'll hear, well, we want to preserve the frontline healthcare workers, which are nurses and doctors, but we don't want to talk about frontline workers who are doing the laundry or providing nutrition services, right? It's seen as a kind of divide and conquer sort of things. The messaging that the government has been using during the pandemic vis-a-vis physicians has been one that's designed to drive a wedge between people who see themselves as regular folk and the idea that you've got these physicians who are greedy. It's a completely it doesn't match the empirical evidence about what's actually been going on. I'm noticing the question somebody's put in the chat about their having a conversation with their MLA, and it's this idea that we as us are going to want pristine healthcare and we want it to look a certain kind of way, but them, Alberta Health Services, they're the reason why we can't have nice healthcare because it's so expensive in terms of administration, or the doctors are the reason why we can't have this because it's so expensive, or somebody else is the reason why we can't have it, be this kind of ideal way that we want it to be. And so what I would encourage people to start to watch for is how the rhetoric sets up opponents, us versus them in the context of healthcare. Who gets to be counted as somebody who gets advocated for and who doesn't? And then relating directly to Ubaka's comment, this is the idea of what data gets disclosed about who's accessing healthcare, who's falling through the cracks, the social determinants of health, things along those lines. One of the things I'm really worried about with this particular government is that they are working really hard to not disclose information that we can then use to hold them accountable, not only in terms of basic policy operation, but also in terms of the things that relate to the justice of things like healthcare policy. So if you don't have the data, you actually can't do the work. Right? Between this rhetorical strategy of trying to misidentify who the opponent is, or trying to make a fight where there isn't necessarily one to begin with, followed by we just don't want you to have information about what this actually looks like in terms of implementation. This is what starts to make me really nervous. But on the public opinion side of things, I can say that there's overwhelming support for public healthcare. And usually people say, well, we should be spending more to support healthcare. Canadians are really consistent in terms of what they think and feel about this. Whether or not that's actually mapped onto what we demand from our governments is a different story, though.
I think that raises a lot of key points all of you are touching on with respect to the role of citizens and the ability for us to speak out and understand what's going on in our healthcare system, but broadly within our democracy. And we have a few questions off the top. Heather, I'll go to you that relates to that whole question of who gets to speak out and in what way. Anahi Johnson talks about how, and actually says, hi, Heather, are there legal challenges that can be launched? Do any of the recent actions by the Alberta government contravene the Canadian Charter? There's another question from an anonymous person about Bill 32. I'm assuming both of these are about trying to silence workers, as you say, through that bill. And so if you can elaborate a little bit more for people on that.
Absolutely. We believe there are charter challenges with Bill 32. I mean, you start adding up what piece of legislation that has been coming forth doesn't have charter challenges perhaps embedded in it. But yes, we believe that it is challengeable, and certainly unions are putting together such a challenge here in Alberta. Alberta Federation of Labor, our union, and many others are part of a coalition wanting to challenge various elements of Bill 32, which incredibly was called the Restoring Balance to Alberta Workplaces Act. And what it absolutely does is unbalance and try to stop unions from having a visible role in public dialogue and encouraging and supporting the ability of others who may not have resources to participate in that dialogue and advocacy. Bill 32 is just one of many. There's potential challenges with Bill 1 in terms of limiting the right to demonstrate. There's challenges, we believe, in terms of what has happened with our pensions, public sector pensions here in Alberta. But Bill 32 certainly, we believe, has many elements that can be challenged. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we don't have the regulations, which are the details to Bill 32, to be able to move forward. I had a quote, and I carry it around with me because it's so important to me, and it was actually from JFK many, many years ago. And those who would destroy or further limit the rights of organized labor, those who would cripple collective bargaining or prevent organization of the organized, do a disservice to the cause of democracy. And that's really what I feel is happening here in this province.
Yes, thank you, Heather. That's very powerful. Ubaka, there's a question for you that asks you to talk further about the UCP response to the pandemic and wanting you to provide further comment.
Sure. The essence of the response to the pandemic now is that the government is actually not respecting the law enacted by the legislature as representatives of the people of Alberta. And I think what we're seeing lately with the increase in numbers and deaths, and the fact that we're now fully into a second wave that could have been avoided, is a failure to follow the law. What do I mean by that? The thrust of it is that when you're in a pandemic, when you have a disease outbreak in the community and there's a public health emergency, you need to depoliticize decision making in a lot of ways. The government has to act in good faith and with only one thing in mind: stopping the disease. You really can't have a functional economy or province or any jurisdiction whatsoever cannot function without eliminating the disease or suppressing it. That is reflected in the Public Health Act, that the singular goal in a pandemic is to give authority, full authority, to a healthcare professional, a public health professional who knows the science and who can marshal the science to stop the disease. It doesn't mean that this person shouldn't work with government. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't collaborate with government. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't take into account factors like the economy and how the government wants to run whatever it wants to run. It's a depoliticized office in a lot of ways. The person has the ability to make a decision with one goal in mind: stopping the disease. And everything that the government does at that time should, in good faith, reflect this aim. What I think has happened in the office of the Chief Medical Officer of Health, who's the person I'm talking about, who's authorized to do this, is that she's been stripped somehow of the ability to carry out her statutory responsibilities. She's now been left in a situation where she can't make calls to stop the disease, and where stopping the disease is not a paramount consideration. The government has taken over the process, and as you would expect, because they're not scientists, they're not medical people, they have totally bungled the situation. What that says is that Albertans need to demand from their MLAs when they go, after the pandemic is over, that we need to strengthen that office. It needs to be like the Auditor General's office.
Thank you, Ubaka. That's great. Melanie, I noticed the top 3 questions are all for you in the next one, and there is some interconnection between them. Melanee Johnson's question asking you to talk about democratic power and what we can do to take it back, and how do we challenge polarized effective partisanship. There's also a question with respect to, from Anonymous, what can regular citizens do about these problems with the government not sharing data, and Mireille Kang's question around proportional representation. I'll throw them all over to you to see if you can combine them together.
The first thing I would say is that there's no government in Canada that gets elected without ensuring that they appeal to people beyond their base or their partisans. And so in that sense, I think the thing that I find most frustrating, like as a citizen of Alberta, but then also as a political scientist who studies democratic engagement, is this idea that people who don't like what they're seeing in government, if it's a conservative government, they just say, well, it's very fatalistic. It's like, what could we possibly do? They're a juggernaut. They're always going to win. Mark well, the only reason why anybody wins government, any political party wins government in Canada, is because people who do not identify with them vote for them, which means that you need like a lot of voters who are not polarized partisans to go along with you. In this sense, I would say one of the best ways that we can fight this idea of becoming polarized, this idea that we get defined or that Albertans get defined in a particularly narrow way, and that like our neighbors get identified as enemies that we need to fight, is to just refuse to engage in that kind of process, and to also sanction political actors who want us to do that. And so in this sense, if I'll liken it to the United States, this is the idea where I'm not saying that you should be mean to your relatives, and I'm not saying that you should be mean to your neighbors, but there is something to be said for drawing a line in the sand, being like, I actually think that that's not an appropriate way to frame politics and things along those lines. It also involves, like, I don't want to do the whole kumbaya, finding points of commonality, all these other sorts of things as well. But I mean, for folks who want to do that there's definitely space for it as well. The reason why this is such an insidious political tactic, forming this form of identity where you want to get your like geographical, like provincial identity mapped onto a very narrow partisan identity, is if you think about things that you identify strongly with, can you imagine things that would actually shake your identification with them? Like the things that you identify with as an individual, that matter to your psyche, that matter to how you see yourself. Once these things are in place, they're very difficult to shake. I think it's important to focus on like not becoming polarized ourselves. This is the idea of that gut check, particularly if you're having a very angry reaction. If you can say it's being motivated by substantive things and I can list them, then it's like, okay, that's probably not a polarized reaction. But if you're saying, I just hate them for what they're doing, and that's the sum total of the reaction, I think that's something that we should guard against. I would say similar sorts of things with respect to government accountability, regardless of who's in government. Citizens have a right to demand that they see these sorts of things. If you look at how government operates, particularly in terms of like accountability in our system while the legislature, while government is in between elections, most of that accountability is pitched directly to the public. And so I won't go into the details about what accountability mechanisms we actually have in our institutions. Like, they exist and they function as they are designed to exist in a lot of ways. One of the things that it does is it pushes the accountability into the media and into public, which means as the member of a public, we have space to react to these things in ways that we never did before, precisely because this is a democratizing effect of things like the internet. You can also just tell your MLA, particularly if they're a government MLA, that you're not going to vote for them if they don't do some of these things. For some of us, this is a more credible threat than it is for others. The last thing I'll say is that I would caution people against saying that the solution to all of the short-term problems that we see now is to blow up our existing political institutions. My American colleagues, when they were looking at how the US Supreme Court appointments are being politicized, a number of them get distressed at the idea that in order for me to get my way, we need to change the way that the institutions are configured. In order for me to get my way, we need to actually do like whole-scale institutional change. And so professionally, as a political scientist, I get very nervous when people say, I don't like the outcome, therefore we have to change the institution. Because I'm guessing that when I listened to, say, parliamentary committee testimony about the electoral system, the thing that Trudeau and company did in the last parliament, most people said, I don't like the electoral system because my side never wins. This gets to losers' consent, and this gets to how people see and engage in the actual electoral process. But I can tell you from looking at places that actually change their electoral systems, it doesn't solve the problems that people think that it solves. It just creates different unintended consequences because all of these systems have trade-off. So no, I wouldn't recommend in any context that people, if you don't like the current state of politics, is to blow up the institutions. The first thing that you reach for is to organize, to use your power as a voter, and to use the power of like us as the people who ultimately own all of this stuff to be able to move it and shape it in a direction that we would find more palatable.
Thank you, Melanie. You did a great job combining all three of those answers to those questions. So we have a few minutes left, and I see Mel Techmeyer's asked a question that is near and dear to my heart as well with respect to what we need to do to monitor and enforce long-term care quality and delivery, which of course is something we've seen heavily during the pandemic. Parkland Institute is working on a report right now that'll be out sometime in the new year with respect to the frontline healthcare workers. We're looking forward to releasing that. And just a heads up for folks, we are also working with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, our national sister organization, and they are coming out next week with some very strong recommendation national standards for people to look at and advocate for. So look forward to that coming forward. But Heather and Ubaka, can you just in a minute or so touch on your thoughts for Mel?
I point back to the Public Interest Alberta Seniors Task Force priorities for Alberta seniors, and there's several items in there. I mean, one of them is calling for phasing up the private ownership and operation of services. In terms of long-term care. We need transparency. Even contracts that currently exist in terms of contracts between Alberta Health Services and private not-for-profit or private for-profit providers of long-term care, continuing care services. But we need national standards, and Ubaka mentioned that as well. We do need a national strategy when it comes to long-term care, and we need reporting. Even with the Canada Health Act, which does require reporting with respect to private delivery, use of public dollars and private, it doesn't happen. Provinces don't report. This has been an issue for many years, but we need to have enforceable standards and rules, not pre-arranged inspections, for instance, but the ability for the oversight to be able to go in unannounced and do on-site inspections. Public reporting is all part of that as well. There's many, many things that need to be put into a comprehensive long-term care, continuing care, because it's not just seniors, continuing care, long-term care strategy that is enforceable, and we have consistent standards across the country. There are penalties if standards are not met. I mean, there's no point having standards if there's not accountability for them, and transparency and public reporting.
I think I covered that very well. I don't have much to add, other than to say that we do need, as I said before, an integrated transdisciplinary model of care. We need to stop seeing seniors as just people who can be put somewhere, and then when they get sick, we react. Seniors deserve lives that also are based on this idea of social determinants and health promotion. We need to think of a senior strategy that is not just about solving their health problems, but actually enabling them to live in a way that is respectful of their status in our society. I come from a place where, we don't take our seniors lightly. We don't have a lot. It's a poor nation. I couldn't imagine a situation where people where I'm from, if they had the resources we had, would treat our seniors this way.
Can I just add to this very quickly? This is the idea that sunshine is the best disinfectant. And I've seen in the Q&A folks saying, how do we get the public to be aware of this? And it's exactly through this where there are transparent standards and mandatory transparent reporting. I think most people would be horrified if they knew the details of what's going on in continuing care centers or long-term care facilities. And most people have been, precisely because COVID shone a light on it in Alberta, but also in other places as well, particularly with the nefarious things that can come from private delivery and chronic understaffing and all of those sorts of things. I mean, we have the Auditor General, and the Auditor General can do performance audits to see if policy is working the way that it's supposed to, but this stuff is all empowered if we demand clear and transparent standards, clear and transparent reporting. And to be frank, most members of the public aren't going to pay attention to this every day because there are really good reasons why people don't do that. But there are lots of good journalists who do, that would make it in that particular form of news. And so I wouldn't focus on educating the public per se. I would be focusing on setting the system up so that that system works that way with that transparency. Because when something does hit the fan, or if it does need our attention, then this structure is there to facilitate shining the light on it.
Excellent. I just saw someone post in chat how they work on the front lines of long-term care. And as we're seeing with our study that we're doing, it is the front line that is the heroes here that are working day in, day out, holding things together. And I think Heather referenced that as well. I would actually ask, in closing, for each of the three of you before we go, given Thomas Homer Dixon's talk last night on his book, Commanding Hope, it had a powerful message about citizens and their sense of hope is critical for that political change that we're looking for to set us on that right path. In a minute or less, I'll start with you, Heather. Can you talk about what gives you real hope for change for Alberta in the future?
I always have hope. I can't imagine a world where we abandon all hope, because if we abandon all hope, we will not make any change. I have hope because I see and I talk to people that, they may not have the resources, but they have the will. And I think of some of the people who've been on what has been many decades of a journey, their own investments, Carol Wodak, just to name one, in terms of all the stuff with respect to seniors care and long-term care. I have hope because of the people I have been fortunate enough to come into contact with during my career who don't do it because they have to do it. They don't do it because they're paid to do it. They do it because it is their mission. They believe in it. I believe there are far more people in our world who are motivated by that kind of we need to do it versus I have to do it belief. And that's what gives me hope.
I'm a pessimist by nature, but I'll have to go with youth. Young people give me a lot of hope. I have to be honest, I try to just stay young in my head because I had there's a passion that I grew up with, a need to fight injustice and things that don't sit well with me. And people, as I grow older, people try to tame it with all kinds of like threats and, you're going to get into trouble. I have to keep defying that. I think there's something rich about just knowing that you want to shake the world up and change it. We have to keep moving forward.
I have a unique talent for bringing things to a very grim spot. So I'm going to apologize in advance if I manage to be the total downer on which we end this. I'm also a cynic, and so I tend not to be very positive about these things, in which case I would say, so my hope is that Albertans are angry and that in examining their anger, they clarify the problem and then they start to take steps to make the thing that's making them angry not be an issue anymore. And I say this in the context of like effective polarization, where I want people to do the navel gazing to say, am I angry because I'm in an us versus them like circle of politics, and it's just because I dislike them that I'm really mad about this stuff? In which case, I think there's got to be individual power for citizens to kind of break that particular cycle. But with respect to organizing to get us to a better place, those negative emotions, I wouldn't necessarily say that we need to get rid of them. I think we need to interrogate them to say, like, what is it that's making me angry? What is it that's making me anxious and nervous about the future? Energy transition certainly should be one of them. I know that makes me anxious. And so the idea is, what is it that's making that be a problem? And then let's figure out the steps that we're going to take to actually proactively try to find a solution. The idea that makes me hopeful is that individuals in Alberta, instead of being fatalistic about their politics and the things they think that they can't change, they'll take their power back and they'll use it.
Wonderful. It is an important thing for us to self-reflect on what is it that is motivating us, and if we are able to motivate ourselves for our passion for our communities, for each other, and for a better world, then that's what's going to sustain and drive us forward. I am just noticing as well some beautiful quotes in the chat. There's somebody, Anahi, quoting Arundhati Roy, "A better world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And I think that captures, in essence, what people are looking for in Alberta right now in this very trying times. So I want to thank so much the three of you for participating in our first panel. And then I'm going to turn it over to our next three speakers. I will introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. We're very pleased to have Binnu Jeyakumar. She is the director of the Clean Energy Program for the Pembina Institute. Her portfolio includes managing the phase out of coal power, integrating renewables, and modernizing the grid. She has expertise in fossil fuel and renewable generation technologies, community energy, and sustainable strategy development. She has designed and convened several multi-stakeholder engagements on energy policy issues. So we're very pleased to have you here, Binnu. Next is Ricardo Acuña, of course, no stranger to folks from the Parkland Institute. Ricardo is currently the president of the Association of Academic Staff at the U of A. He is normally the executive director of the Parkland Institute, but was elected earlier this year, which is why I'm in this role for 2 years, in this role again, having been the first executive director back in the 90s. The Faculty Association represents 4,000 professors, teaching staff, librarians, researchers, and administrators on campus. He has a degree in political science and history from the University of Alberta and has over 20 years of experience as a volunteer, staffer, and consultant for various non-government and nonprofit organizations around the province. He's spoken extensively and written on energy policy, democracy, privatization, and the Alberta economy. He's a regular media commentator on post-secondary issues and public policy issues. And he's also, in his spare time, because he's obviously not busy enough, currently the co-chair of Oxfam Canada and the interim chair of Oxfam International. Our third speaker is Janice Makokis. Janice is Nihayahu Iskiu Cree woman and a mother from Onahi Sikawaskapin Saddle Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6 territory. She is an Indigenous legal scholar, Indigenous researcher, a truth teller, and an educator. Currently, Janice works with various Indigenous nations in the area of treaty advocacy and protection, the development and implementation of Indigenous laws, and land based on Indigenous education and governance issues. She is a sessional faculty at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Extension's Indigenous Program and Yellowhead Tribal College's Indigenous Governance Program. She served as the co-chair, co-coordinator of the North American Indigenous Peoples Caucus from 2013 to 2016, a voluntary Indigenous body that makes recommendations to the agenda items to be addressed by the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And she was a key part of organizing the group that established Idle No More. As you can see, three incredibly busy people. We're very pleased to have you all here today. So we're going to turn it over to you, Binnu, to start off your first 5 minutes there. Thank you.
My talk is going to be talking about some of the opportunities for us coming out of the pandemic and what the future of Alberta could look like. Just giving an overview of the Pembina Institute for those of you who don't know us. We are a nonprofit think tank. We work on climate policies that support the economy as well as communities. We do a lot of research and convening. We also work directly with industry, government, and communities on practical solutions. We've been operating for over 30 years, and I have to say in our history, this is probably one of the most critical moments. Countries across the world are trying to figure out how they can emerge from the pandemic with a just and sustainable future. This is a massive reset to the economy, the scale that the world has rarely seen. And this is all happening at the same time when the climate crisis is at its most urgent. I want to talk through first sort of three of the many reasons why Alberta should actually embrace this diversification of the economy. And then at the very end, I'll touch a bit on what we can do to embrace it. So first, this is about Albertans' health and well-being. Like I said, you've heard a lot of nuanced views today and over the week from experts on healthcare. The one layer I want to add to this is the connection between health and climate action. So the graph you see here is one concrete example from powering down coal plants. Canada has committed to phasing out coal-fired electricity generation by 2030. It's actually one of the most effective greenhouse gas emission reduction policies we've had to date. But if you look at what this means for Albertans, it means avoiding 93 premature deaths per year compared to 2015 numbers. It means $461 million of cost savings related to health impacts. And this is all from just phasing out coal power plants. Other piece I wanted to mention, and I guess you hear this in all the rhetoric today, is the jobs versus environment. And I would say there would be no jobs without an environment. We did actually a pretty conservative study on what it means to Alberta if we were to diversify our economy in terms of jobs. And we found that between now and 2030, so just in the next decade, we can create over 67,000 jobs in renewables, in transit and EV infrastructure, electric vehicle infrastructure, energy efficiency, and even oil and gas. There is a lot of work to be done to clean up oil and gas, reclaim the oil and gas sites that are shutting down, as well as to reduce emissions from our oil and gas sector. But this doesn't even capture some of the newer technologies that are coming on board, like hydrogen, which would create even more jobs and create brand new industries for Alberta were we to embrace that. The last reason why I want to talk about is affordability. Obviously, this is on everyone's minds as pocketbooks are being squeezed. You know, everyone is convinced renewables are clean, they're good for the environment. The fact that renewables are cheap is also becoming more and more well known. I won't bother you with the charts that show renewable prices dropping dramatically. One really interesting statistic is institutes are predicting by 2030, so just in a decade, building new solar and wind farms is going to be cheaper than continuing to operate the existing coal fleet in the world. In Alberta, we did an analysis to compare gas against clean energy. So what we looked at is what is the cost of building a new gas plant in Alberta? Because this is a big question for Alberta. We're phasing out coal power. What are we going to build to replace it? So we took a look at the economics of a new gas plant. Then we took a look at building a portfolio of clean energy that includes renewables, energy efficiency, storage, and demand side management that provides the same services as the gas plant. So it's comparing apples to apples. And we looked at the cost. And even in Alberta, where gas is really cheap, we found that the clean energy options are cheaper than gas. So, these are some really important things to take into consideration as we move forward. And then I wanted to quickly touch on what are some things we can do to enable this emerging economy. I'd say number one, maybe because of Pembina's bias towards policy solutions, I'd say it's policies to lower emissions. We have a new government south of the border, very likely. In January, they're going to have really stringent policies on carbon. They're going to be promoting their clean energy solutions in a big way, and we need to keep in step with them. So this means we need to make sure our policies are progressive, that they get progressively stringent on emissions, and we continue to invest in clean energy. The other piece I would say is for the geeks out there, policies and regulations. A lot of the market rules we have in Alberta right now were developed when fossil fuel was king. And so they favor those older technologies, and they need to be updated to make sure that the new emerging technologies have a level playing field to compete in. The third piece, actually, I can't do the justice that Melanee did to it in the last panel. She talked a lot about polarization, partisanship, and identity politics. And that plays out not just in healthcare, but also in the environment and energy space. And we need to figure out a way to go beyond that polarization. We need to be able to create a political space for any government to be able to take ambitious climate action. And what that means is we need to work with everybody in Alberta to make sure we have some momentum behind asking for climate ambition. The last piece I'd say is probably the most important. I'd be lying if I said this is not a massive transition that doesn't impact Albertans in many ways. There are workers and communities whose livelihood is going to be massively impacted. We should be focusing on how do we support them. Just as an example, there are many communities that are losing their revenues because oil and gas production is down and they were relying on oil and gas facilities for their revenues. So the question is, okay, how can we bring on new cleaner technologies that they can earn from and create new jobs? I might end there and just leave you with the thought that I think Alberta right now is at a crossroads, and we need to decide, do we want to step forward with the countries of the world that are investing in a green recovery from this pandemic, or do we want to try and double down on a path that's no longer sustainable? This road to diversification is not easy. There's a lot of complex issues we need to deal with it. But I'd say this is our only path forward if we want to create a sustainable and just future for all Albertans.
Thank you so much, Binnu. That was wonderful. We'll now turn it over to Ricardo for your thoughts.
Thanks, Bill. It really is a little strange to be on this side of a Parkland conference rather than on the side of the Parkland conference that you find yourself on, Bill. But it really is great to be here. It's great to see so many people attending on a Saturday afternoon and participating and engaged in discussions. This notion of complex challenges, I think, and what post-secondary education can offer to deal with these challenges is a critical one, not just province-wide, but particularly for organizations like the Parkland Institute, which find themselves embedded in a university and are part, I think, of the solution to some of these challenges. We know that we're facing a number of crises right now, right? We're dealing with an economy that's really, really struggling, an economic crisis as a result of the overdependence and over-reliance on one sector that Binnu was speaking about. We've got the public health crisis, the pandemic that is COVID. We've got this crisis of democracy and public discourse that Melanee was speaking about, and the diminished level of democracy that we have today. And of course, we've got climate change coming at us. In terms of how this government views the role of post-secondary education in the midst of all these crises, it's actually quite frightening. Right now, the provincial government is in the midst of a review of the entire post-secondary system in Alberta, a review they're calling Alberta 2030. And what they are prioritizing in this review is three things. The first is an entire post-secondary system that acts almost as a vocational job skills training center. Now, yeah, there's some room for that in post-secondary education, of course, but this government sees that as the only role of post-secondary education in the province. The second is they're seeking to prioritize through this review only that research which can be commercialized. If it doesn't have commercial or monetary value or can be invested in by the private sector, the provincial government does not see that as valid research to support in post-secondary education. And then their third priority in this review seems to be finding ways to give the private sector, the marketplace, industry, privileged access to determining what programs are offered, what courses are offered, what curricula look like in the post-secondary education system. So this is what the government seems focused on right now in terms of how post-secondary contributes. It's entirely inconsistent with what post-secondary, what advanced education has historically offered to advancement in times of crises in societies. We're talking about the role that a solid curiosity-based research system can have on developing new alternatives, on bringing about new ways of looking at the world, new ways of thinking, new ways of talking about our economy and our energy and our politics. We're talking about a venue where people who have lost their jobs in one industry, that a sunset industry, can go and explore new opportunities, can explore new avenues and new ways of knowing. A place where the foundation of academic freedom provides for public intellectuals, people like Melanee and Ubaka and Janice, who we've got coming up, or Ubaka, who are able to contribute and help save democracy and rebuild our democracy and engage people in transforming democracy for the public interest. The government doesn't see that. And the government is actually not just trying to reform the purpose of post-secondary education right now, but defunding post-secondary education in the process. We've seen a cut across the board over the 4 years that this government is going to be in power of approximately $1 billion in funding to post-secondary education in Alberta. At the U of A, we're seeing a cut. We've already seen $110 million worth of cuts, and we know there's another $106 million coming in the next 2 years. That's 33% of the University of Alberta's Campus Alberta grant that will be cut by the time this government is done. So at a time of pandemic, at a time when we want more students accessing university, at a time when we want to support public intellectuals, when we want to support research and transformation, the government is actually working in the opposite direction. What we need out of post-secondary education today, going forward, is a system that's accessible so that those people seeking new skills, those people seeking to retrain and find something new can access the system. We need protection of academic freedom for public intellectuals at a time when evidence and public discourse, informed dialogue is under attack, not just by government, but by certain elements of the public. And we need strong funding for research. We need strong funding for the supports, administrative supports and research supports that make the work of post-secondary institutions possible. And we need a government that recognizes the important role that the humanities and arts programs can play in moving our society as a whole forward and making us stronger in the public interest.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. That's bang on some of the core issues that we have to address. So Janice, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Bill, and the organizers for inviting me to participate in this amazing panel of wonderful people today. And when you asked me to join the panel and to offer up a few words to reflect on the current complexities that we're experiencing within this province, and for me to specifically reflect on how this impacts me as an Indigenous person, an Indigenous woman, there was no hesitation that I wanted to offer up some of my thoughts. And I join you today from my parents' basement in Saddle Lake, which in Cree we say Onyx Gabowen, and it's Nehia Wisquel Cree woman from Saddle Lake Cree Nation. I'm in Treaty 6, and the perspective that I want to approach some of my reflective commentary is from a treaty lens and the perspective of being an Indigenous woman, a mother, and somebody who's been on the front lines as a grassroots organizer that has challenged government agendas federally, both federally and provincially. And when I listen to the previous panelists and speakers provide a very like a macro level perspective of how this is impacting people, I wanted to kind of bring it down to my level to share how this affects like me as a person and grassroots person, that especially an Indigenous person that lives directly in the community on reserve. And so when I think about how the current politics have impacted me and Indigenous people specifically, there's been a direct attack on education. There's been an attack on healthcare. There's been an attack on policies and laws with respect to energy resources and lands. And how do we look at these issues from a place of decolonizing these institutions and bringing to the forefront the inequities that exist, and commenting on the racialized injustice and violence that continues to be perpetuated against Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, and people just seeking, to do the right thing and have justice in general within these political spaces that we find ourselves in. When I think about what's happening right now, I have to look at what's happening even within the pandemic as a place of pause and reflection, because within Indigenous knowledge systems, our elders would tell us that everything happens for a reason. And they have actually prophesized the moment that we are going through generations ago. And so when the pandemic hit in the spring and we heard what was happening, we're going through this lockdown, my immediate thinking and mindset went back to the teachings of the elders that talked about what we refer to in our teachings as the hard times. And this prophecy of everything happening right now as a slowdown to teach us to have these moments of teaching and quiet for us to reflect on everything that's happening in the world. And so when I had that pause to reflect of what's happening, it's no surprise that we're coming together collectively to talk about the challenges we're experiencing. Because from the perspective of treaty, we shouldn't be living through what we're going through right now. And if we're thinking about living together in harmony with mutual respect and being in balance with each other and with all of the elements that we exist, what we're experiencing is not supposed to be happening. When the pandemic hit, and I'm thinking about like the violence occurring on the land and the increased racialized violence, I immediately think back to the two Métis hunters that went hunting in the spring to feed their families. And coincidentally or not, the place that they went hunting is like half an hour from where we live. The issues that me and my family have to think through with this increased polarization and the politics that are happening right now, and the outright perpetuating hate as being a normal part of the discourse and the everyday politics that we have to put up with. Where we live in the rural area, now my dad would have to think through, where do I go hunting? Am I going to be safe? Like, we actually have to have these conversations within our immediate family around, okay, Dad, you can't go hunting over there, because if you go hunting over there, there's the chance that a similar situation could happen. So these kinds of conversations are having to happen within our immediate family. And then on a higher macro level, with respect to the changes that are happening with policy and law, when I heard about the K-12 curriculum review and the reasoning that the government was going to remove some of the curriculum that was specifically addressed around residential schools, I thought, wow, we just had the TRC come out 5 years ago, talk about the importance of implementing these 94 calls to action, the importance of public education, the cornerstone of addressing these issues to be education and awareness. And now we have a government that is essentially trying to erase the history of Indigenous people so that my child and the next generations will not have this conversation in front of them in the classroom. It's incredibly worrisome as a parent that this is the type of legacy that we're having to fight through right now. The conversations that we're able to have with and among each other is what gives me hope that we can come to some resolve and come together collectively to address some of these systemic challenges that we're experiencing collectively. When I think about the contagions or the complexity in the issues, and I'm thinking about contagions as the spreading of harmful ideas or practices, I'm thinking about the UCP and their actions and what they're doing to attack all of these different policies and laws. And how are we as engaged citizens and grassroots people and organizers going to use our political power as individuals to hold what our governments and government accountable? The last thing I'll just comment on is the Bill 1 situation, in that they're even taking away the ability for us to protest and organize and express those concerns in that way. And I think it's interesting from an Indigenous perspective that the government introduced this without even consulting or engaging with Indigenous peoples and nations, especially because this is on treaty land and treaty territories. I'll just end by saying that I'm thankful that I'm on a panel with people that are like-minded and critical thinkers, and we can come together and have some good conversation around these really important issues that are impacting all of us.
Thank you so much, Janice, and thank you to the three of you for all of those opening comments. I see we already have a number of questions coming in. And so Janice was just saying with respect to the attack that people get when you raise questions that are counter to what the UCP government want. And Ahmed has raising the question around whether or not you've been attacked by the War Room. We know here at the Parkland Institute, we were working with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives recently on a report that came out on the Trans Mountain Pipeline and why it is not going to actually increase the value of our bitumen overseas. It was a really solid report. And the War Room attacked us and attacked the author for that. So again, it's about closing down any democracy, etc. So just if you could refer to the political culture, if you will, of being attacked for raising very legitimate fundamental concerns.
Yeah, Bill, for sure. $30 million War Room definitely has been throwing punches. We haven't found it, to be very productive. So obviously, they've been investigating where our funding is coming from, but they haven't even spoken with us. We have no idea where they're getting their information from. There is no transparency in the process. It goes very against any principles of science or basic evidence-based decision making. And I can see this trend in other places too. Pembina is not political, we don't adhere to one political party or another, but we do see the value of political leadership, and we know we can't get anywhere without political leadership. We are open to presenting data to the government, and we have approached this government also with our analyses, research recommendations. Many of them have been ignored. But I think one thing, maybe if I can just point out also, there is the government, but there are other actors here in the space. There's also industry. And we have found industry to be more responsive because they are directly impacted by where oil prices are and where demand for oil prices are going. Even the carbon pricing, Shell was one of the first entities to put an internal carbon price before even the Alberta government put a carbon price on it. One thing we might see where a government is reluctant to take evidence-based steps on clean energy is industry might get ahead of it, or municipal governments might get ahead of it. and definitely citizens groups. There's a lot of citizen groups who are ahead of it too.
Well, that's very interesting, and actually leads to a comment that I see in the chat by Blanche, talking about how educated people who can think for themselves and challenge the status quo are a threat, and how Marie is also saying that, the government wants to make sure that people are unaware of these issues and not having these types of honest, real conversations. Ricardo, I know you're aware that Parkland put out a report by one of our authors, Laurie Adkin, on the role of the oil and gas industry on investing in post-secondary education, but in doing so in a way to control what actually gets studied and what actually gets researched here at the university. Can you talk about that interconnection between post-secondary and the environment, and how industry is a very big player when it comes to what happens here?
Well, it speaks very clearly to the problem of having the corporate sector, the private sector determine what it is gets researched, what it is we fund, how curriculums are developed, how programs are developed. Because you have an industry in a sector who's interested in funding in their self-interest and in their self-interest for today, right? In what will benefit them in the short term. You're not going to get then research being done that will have an impact 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now in how we develop energy systems and in how we think about energy. You're not going to get that, because if the only money available for research is money provided by an industry that's interested in meeting their goals for the next 3 years or 4 years, then that's a serious problem. What we've seen with Laurie's report in particular is the sense that the work that will be required to help us move through this climate crisis, right, will be not just work in energy systems and not just work in alternative energies, but also work in the humanities and rethinking our economy, rethinking our democratic systems, rethinking who has power. And if we're relying on industry to invest, and then the only possible investor in research, those things are never going to get funded. So what we will get is replication of the flawed power structures, the flawed economic overdependence, and the flawed political systems that we have today, and never actually be able to move forward as a society. So that's the danger of saying, well, let's let industry invest and let's, focus on research that industry will support.
Great. Thank you, Ricardo. Janice, Marion Buller, when she spoke on Wednesday night, was really powerful, talking about how important it is that we decolonize our institutions. And we see some questions and comments with respect to our education curriculum debate that's beginning here. Can you talk about sort of your view of what it would mean to decolonize some of these systems, post-secondary, which I know you're involved in, K-12, because we have a few questions related to that.
As a parent to a son who is 6 years old, who is just entering, I guess, the public education system, I'm seeing this firsthand. The actions of the provincial government in the committee they established to review the current K-12 curriculum, to remove any kind of references to residential schools up to grade, I think 4 or 5, I think is incredibly damaging and problematic. And when I think about the ability of children to understand complex issues, there's no question that they can. I actually think children are more intelligent than a lot of adults. My son asks me questions about the solar system. Why do people not like, other people because they look different or whatever? If we remove that core piece of our collective history, talks about why we're living with the legacy of colonialism now and why we are experiencing the systemic inequities and the systemic violence with ongoing colonialism and not decolonizing institutions, we're doing a disservice to our future children, our future generations, in handing them over a system that's flawed. It's incumbent upon us to fight back against the government, the government's agenda now to try and remove those things from the curriculum that we know can help better our future in terms of raising our children in a way that allows them to know the true history of this country and the true history of our people. And we want to raise them to be engaged, critical thinking citizens. By not doing something to address what's happening with the education system and the committee that's going on, I think we're in serious jeopardy of future problems.
Absolutely, and that's why I think the Alberta Teachers Association, parents across this province are doing a really effective job of organizing and raising and making sure that our systems are open to real critical dialogue and discussion and a fact-based system. I know in a Trump-like world, a post-fact world, we're getting away from actually valuing, as Ricardo was saying, real research, real intellectual inquiry. And we want that in our K-12 system. We want that in our post-secondary system and throughout. Binnu, I see the top two questions in our Q&A are both sort of directed towards you. One is actually talking about changing and sustaining to clean energy is a globalization effort as an individual. What is the one thing we can do right now to contribute to the change, feasible, attainable, and realistic? That's a reference to Homer Dixon last night. How do we convince the UCP and other conservatives to conserve our environment, take climate science seriously, and stop our oil and gas rather than invest in industries of the future? So two big questions.
My first answer would be political activism, actually. I would reflect the answers that we saw in the previous panel also. I think getting involved politically, asking your municipal government and your provincial government to take strong climate action. 2021, there's going to be a series of municipal elections happening in Alberta. And so we need to show up there and show that citizens care about this. Yes, we care about jobs. We also know we need to invest in clean energy to keep those jobs, and we care about the health of our citizens. And then the next milestone is 2023 when we have a provincial election. We need to make sure that that election is run based on which party is best suited to establishing a sustainable future for Albertans, and is not reduced down to 8-second sound bites. I know it's not very direct and probably not as gratifying as taking a shorter shower, but I would say that would be the most impactful thing you can do. Bill, the second question, oh my God, that is, you should join Pembina strategy sessions. That is the type of question we're answering when we're trying to set our 5-year strategy is, how do we convince governments that see a false dichotomy between the economy and the environment? To be honest, Alberta had a conservative government for 44 years before we had the 2015 election, right? So it's not necessarily brand new for us, but I do know we have very unprecedented amounts of partisanship and polarization right now. But I'd say some of the strategies we've done in the past with some success is to work with unexpected allies. Governments will expect folks from the progressive movement, from the NGO community, I'd say from unions to put forward certain ideas, and that's something they expect. But I think if you partner with industry or investors, I've recently had calls with investors that are asking, how can we push companies in the electricity sector in Alberta to commit to net zero? So there are investors who are interested in pushing industry. There is industry that is ahead of where the government is, like I mentioned. So I think bringing together some of these unlikely allies. We've also worked with the Alberta Federation of Labor to join the voices of environmental activists and the labor movement to talk about exactly this question of jobs and environment. And, it's way more powerful when you have these diverse voices represented. And I would say voices of those who are impacted by this transition. The government sometimes uses job losses as an excuse not to do something without actually taking clear action to protect the people themselves rather than job numbers from the losses. So that's what I would say. Yeah, I think working with unexpected allies to get our voices heard.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm glad you referenced the municipal elections coming up. That's top of the next questions. And I'm going to throw to you, Ricardo. Rebecca says municipal politics are seen as the most trusted and close to the people, yet the current government has made changes to include referendums, etc., to municipal elections. How do you think this is going to change how we participate in municipal elections? And do you see it hurting municipal politicians this election, especially after this pandemic?
Thanks, Bill. I'm really of two minds on this question, right? Because the government has very clearly decided that municipal elections will be the place where they open up the Wild West of money, power, and influence for the wealthy people in this province to have a say. It's the last frontier for them. The previous government put some limits. I mean, obviously didn't go far enough, but put some limits on who can donate, how they can donate to provincial elections. And now this government, at the same time as they are further limiting or trying to limit the possibility of groups like labor groups to play a role in elections provincially, is finding ways for well-funded, corporate-based, market-based political action groups to have a greater role in municipal elections. The reason I say I'm of two minds of it is because in municipal elections in this province, and I think we need to be really honest with ourselves about what it is we're defending as a status quo. Because for the longest time already, municipal elections in this province have been determined by who the developers choose to fund as candidates. So it's never been the case that any person, or rarely been the case, that any person can just decide to run a campaign, put together a few $100s and get some friends to go door knocking and have a really good chance of succeeding in a municipal election. It's been the people who've been funded by developers already. So we've been making a case, Public Interest Alberta has been making the case for taking that type of money out of municipal elections for a long time. And it hasn't happened. What this government has done now is gone in the opposite direction. Yes, defend the ability of citizens to get involved and fight against the corporate involvement, but don't pretend that what we have now is some wonderful moment of municipal election funding, right? Because it's not. It's incredibly flawed. We need to move forward. And I think the previous government missed when they introduced the regulations for the provincial political funding, that they didn't actually apply them strictly to municipalities as well. And I think there's room to move that forward.
Thank you, Ricardo. Janice, we have another question directed to you from Anahi Johnson. She says, what should we be demanding of our healthcare system to make it a safe place for Indigenous healthcare? We certainly saw that in Quebec. We know that these are systemic issues, and Marianne Buller raised that in her own talk on Wednesday night. Talk about decolonizing institutions. What does it take to transition here in Alberta?
I think a key piece to that is education, professional development, and training, and education, and educational awareness, and more of it. And I'm just going to speak from experience here from where I come. So the closest, we have a health center on reserve. So most people here on reserve are able to go and access healthcare to see a family doctor. However, when it reaches a situation where they require hospitalization, the closest towns to us are 30 minutes away. Oftentimes, people experience severe racism when they go to the hospital. So they need either advocates or advocacy right in the hospital, cultural sensitivity training. It goes back to also what Ricardo was talking about, post-secondary. So even within the post-secondary system, there needs to be embedded mandatory courses around Indigenous history, Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous issues. And that can't just be in the Faculty of Arts, in the Faculty of Native Studies. It has to be in all sectors within the university where people get this training. That is the key thing, is education, awareness, and training.
Fantastic. That absolutely is something that we need to all be advocating for and pushing. So I just want to flag for you, Ricardo, that in the chat, KJ has raised the question around donut economics. And I know as chair of Oxfam Canada and International, you know Kate Raworth, who wrote the book on donut economics. They're asking, does fundamentally embracing a different and facilitative economic model not seem like a good place to begin? Would donut economics not be a solution-oriented metaphor to rally around? We could go with layer cake, but at some point it's better to take up the version. The layer cake reference, for those who didn't see Armine Yalnizyan's fantastic speech on Thursday night, she gave us cake at the end, which I thought was really an awesome way to end her talk. But the cake was a metaphor for how we need a caring economy, how we need to be investing in those things. So,
you know, what I was talking about when I was talking about what we need from universities is its ability to look at the world, to look at economics, to think about how we exist in different ways. And Kate in Donut Economics does that, right? It's a fresh, new way, not just to understand what we have now, but to say economically, this is how we can build a system that has limits built into it, right? That respects the needs of people, first and foremost, understanding that as a function of an economy, but also has this notion of social, environmental growth limits built into it automatically. And I think that's something that we don't currently have, right? The questions of limits, for example, whether they're natural environmental limits or any other kind of limits, are things that we have to force onto the system today. And a system like Donut Economics does that and makes it intrinsic. And I think it may not be the ideal system, but as a starting point for a discussion about how we could do things differently, how we could structure things differently, it's critical. And those are the conversations we should be having, right? Even Armine's cake layer model was really, really fascinating, right? It's a bit more grounded in the system we have today rather than taking what we have today and reimagining it completely. But it's still, let's look at these things in different ways and stop thinking of the economic system that we have today as the only alternative. The person asking the question says that's a critical starting point, is to open ourselves up to there might be other ways to structure our economies.
thank you. Well, that's a great way to bring this close to an end. I would actually ask the panel, like I asked the first panel, to each give us less than a minute. What is it that gives you hope? Hope in the sense that Thomas Homer Dixon spoke about last night, that is powerful, that is about agency for people in order to get us on that right path. So, Binnu, I'm going to throw to you first.
I have to copy Ubaka. I also think it's today's youth that give me hope. I'm just so inspired and impressed by the work that they're doing. I see them at the City Hall here in Calgary, gathering every Friday without missing it, even when it's minus 25 degrees outside, and they're asking the government to take action on climate. When I was their age, I think doing my part for the environment meant, cutting those 6-pack plastic rings. We never even asked, why is this plastic ring ending up in the ocean that we have to protect the fish from it? But look at youth that age today. They're showing up to budget proceedings in front of city council with comprehensive plans on what the city can do to diversify the economy and invest in clean energy. So, I think the youth today have such a sophisticated understanding. I totally agree with Janice. We don't give them enough credit for how complex their thinking can be and the action that they can take. So I think they can do a really big job in just pushing governments and political leaders also to, stop taking half measures and take actually big step changes to promote a more just and sustainable future.
Wonderful. Thank you. Ricardo?
Thanks, Bill. What gives me hope? People like Heather, Ubaka, Melanie, Janice, and Binnu, who, in the face of attacks on public sector workers, on union leaders, on evidence, on public intellectuals, in the face of growing misogyny, systemic racism, continue to speak up, speak out, share their wisdom and knowledge with all of us, and to give me hope the more than 100 people who are in this room right now listening to them, who will take up those ideas and despite all of that, carry them forward.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ricardo. Janice?
Can I just say ditto to everybody else before me? What gives me hope is these kinds of engagements, these kind of panels, this type of conference where we have people coming together from different backgrounds, different experiences, different areas of expertise that are lending our voices, perspectives together to imagine a different future, to envision a future that is outside of the norm of what current politics and governments are putting on the plate for us to eat, so to speak. And I think about my son, my mom, who had a vision to have a video to talk about treaties, and the whole HSAA supported this walk from Edmonton to Calgary last year. Like, it just takes one person with one vision, and then to put those thoughts into action to make change. When I know that that is possible, that's what gives me hope.
Wonderful concluding comment there. And I see people are putting applause and thank you in the chat. I really appreciate that. So thank you so much, Binnu, Janice, and Ricardo, and of course, Heather, Melanie, and Ubaka for having this conversation with us today. We absolutely want to continue with the Parkland Institute to have these important, challenging conversations and to come together to build that community of awareness and to get people thinking more broadly. And so that's very much what Parkland is all about. And I will say that while the formal part of the conference is wrapping up now, just to remind people, we have recorded this event. It will be posted on our YouTube site. Thanks again to Health Sciences Association for the support on that. And I want to thank again all of our speakers, but I also want to thank all the others that are supporters of Parkland Institute, particularly our board members and those who agreed to moderate our talks this week. We really appreciate all of your time. I know how incredibly busy you are, and so thank you to them too. I also have to absolutely thank our incredible staff, our research managers, Ian Hussey and Rebecca Graff-McRae. They have been doing so much amazing work and research and connecting on these critical issues that we've been discussing all this week. And of course, behind the scenes with me is Charlene Oliver, our office administrator, and Sarah Pratt, our communications coordinator. I have to end by saying Trevor Harrison, our director for the past 10 years, he's led all the programming for the conference. He's stepping down this year. We are forever grateful for all of the work Trevor does to support us as our academic director. We look forward to actually seeing you, well, at least virtually in this time tonight, and being able to talk with you at the party. I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much. Good night.